So many people with Asperger's syndrome and high-functioning autism have this condition called alexithymia, which I simply refer to as emotional blindness. Many of you who have researched autism have heard of mind blindness, and I won't go into that in this video, although there will be a link underneath this video that will direct you to more information on mind blindness. But in this video, we're really talking about emotional blindness. So what I mean by that is, if I have alexithymia, I'm not really sure how I feel, and I have a problem putting my feelings into some type of a vocabulary. I also have trouble reading other people's emotions or understanding what they're referring to when they're actually talking about their emotions. So since I'm kind of in the dark with respect to emotions, both in myself and others, I prefer talking to people about their daily activities and about facts and tasks rather than feelings. So if I have alexithymia, I have difficulty communicating or describing emotions to others, so it's difficult for me to find the right words for my feelings. And since it's awkward conversation for me, the feelings conversation, I tend to want to shy away from those conversations. It's especially problematic for me in the case where I have a neurotypical spouse and she wants to talk to me about how she feels, and it's a double whammy for me, so to speak, when she wants to talk to me about how she feels with respect to the problems we're having in the relationship. So now I'm really in a conversation that I don't want to have. Also, when I'm in a conversation with my spouse about feelings and about problems in the relationship, I have feelings that I can't quite identify. So honestly, I can't even have an emotionally intelligent conversation with my neurotypical wife because she's really speaking French and I simply don't know how to speak French. In fact, alexithymia literally means no words for feelings. So if I have the inability to understand the intricacies of feelings and emotions, and I have difficulty trying to name, understand, and talk about feelings, I'm either going to avoid conversations where I'm required to talk about how somebody else feels and how I feel, or if I do try to have that conversation, I'm probably going to do it very poorly, which I then run the risk of coming off to the other individual as insensitive, uncaring, selfish, lacking empathy and sympathy, and maybe even come off as being somewhat narcissistic. So alexithymia is not just a lack of interest in emotional connection. It's a lack of desire to engage in emotional connection because I struggle with it so much. And that's frustrating to me. But unfortunately, it's also frustrating to the person that wants to connect with me at an emotional level, and I simply can't or don't. Some of the symptoms of alexithymia would be a narrow capacity to understand the reasons behind certain emotions, heightened sensitivity to physical touch, which causes a real problem in the area of intimacy with my significant other, struggling to identify emotions expressed by others, difficulty with naming different kinds of emotions, indifference towards other people, and in some cases saying or doing something that others perceive as highly inappropriate because I simply don't have the emotional intelligence to filter some of the things that I may say or do that may be hurtful to others. Another interesting and unfortunate manifestation of alexithymia is, since I'm not in tune with my emotions, that doesn't mean that the emotion isn't there. It just means that I can't identify it very well with the emotional part of my brain. So what ends up happening is I tend to get physical symptoms of the emotion that's not getting expressed properly. In other words, I have a particular feeling that I can't express in a functional way, and so my body ends up expressing that feeling in perhaps a dysfunctional way. For example, a person who is very angry yet doesn't know how to express their anger might develop a stomach ache or a headache or an ulcer. A person who is very anxious but can't identify that they're in a state of anxiety might develop high blood pressure. They may slip into rage, meltdowns, and even shutdowns. The treatment options for alexithymia are usually very different from typical counseling or talk therapy. The therapist who has an expertise in this area will most likely concentrate on building a foundation of naming emotions and appreciating a range of emotions. or more broadly, the process will involve helping the individual grow their emotional intelligence. So, high-functioning autism, or ASD level 1, is a developmental disorder. And what that means is developmentally, your partner or spouse on the autism spectrum has a social emotional brain that is underdeveloped relative to its logical brain. So you, if you are an NT wife, neurotypical, you no doubt are very high in social intelligence, very high in emotional intelligence. Your partner on the spectrum is low in both of those areas. And to make matters even slightly more complicated, the autistic brain is overly logical. So we have the underdeveloped social emotional brain and the overly developed logical brain. Now, why could that cause a problem? You wouldn't think that having too much logic could possibly be an issue. It's like, how can you eat too many vegetables? But if you have an overly logical brain, you get stuck in analysis all the time. You get stuck in the planning phase. You get stuck hooked on one little detail, and you can't move forward with implementation. It's hard to get from thought to action. You may have experience with your husband who has high-functioning autism that, for example, if you're planning a vacation, he plans and plans and plans and plans and gets stuck on just 2 or 3 details, and he can't see the big picture. And then you have to be the one to actually implement the plan. So with the overly logical brain, you get stuck on a thought, and it's hard to move forward with action. You've heard of the phrase ready, aim, fire, right? So with the overly logical brain, it's like ready, aim, 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 and you never get to the fire part. So if I have an overly logical brain and I am planning a project, for example, initially I am the thinker in charge of the thoughts. But when overanalysis kicks in, now the thoughts are in charge of the thinker. And I involuntarily get sucked into rumination. And therefore my thought stream kind of goes in circles. The high-functioning autistic brain is an overthinking brain, and overthinkers believe they're helping themselves by rehashing their problems in their heads or going over all the details with respect to what might go wrong. The overly logical brain will also overthink with respect to relationships. For example, the autistic partner might be thinking along the lines of, I don't think I'm capable of meeting her wants or needs. I doubt that I'll ever understand how she feels. I'm starting to doubt our long-term compatibility. And also, I read a lot of extra things into her words and actions. In other words, I just assume rather than verifying why she is saying or doing what she is, and I will tend to put a negative spin on her behavior. Overanalysis can also result in difficulties making decisions. In other words, I'm not sure what to say or do in this situation, or I'm not sure what would be the perfect pick, option A, or option B, or option C. And also, overanalysis can result in procrastination. It's like, if I can't do this thing perfectly, I'd rather not do it at all. I'll get to it someday. When I have all my ducks lined up in a row, then I'll do it. And as you probably have guessed, in this case, the thing never gets done. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I wanted to take a deep dive into explaining this business of mind blindness and why it can cause problems in relationships. So this will get a little on the technical side. So the Diagnostic Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders defines 6 key domains of cognitive function, and they are social cognition, perceptual motor function, learning and memory, language, executive function, and complex attention. Now, mind blindness, which in essence is the opposite of empathy, is a cognitive disorder in which the person with Asperger's or high-functioning autism is unable to, or finds it very difficult to, predict the mental states of others. For example, their thoughts, beliefs, emotions, desires, behaviors, intentions, and so on. Now, it's not necessarily caused by an inability to imagine an answer, but it is often due to an inability to gather enough information to decipher which of the many possible answers is correct. And this is referred to as an empathetic cognitive deficit. Now, empathy is usually divided into two major components. There's cognitive empathy, and that's the ability to understand another's perspective or mental state. And then there's affective empathy, which is the ability to respond with an appropriate emotion to another's mental state. Now, cognitive and affective empathy are also independent from one another. For example, you may not be very good at understanding another person's perspective, but you may be very good at empathizing with other people. So people on the autism spectrum have deficits in both cognitive and affective empathy. Okay, so now I want to look at the subcategories of both cognitive and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy can be subdivided into three categories. There's tactical or strategic empathy, which is the deliberate use of perspective taking to achieve certain desired ends. Then there is perspective taking, which is the tendency to spontaneously adopt another person's psychological perspective. And then there's fantasy, which is the tendency to identify with fictional characters. Now, there is two categories that can be subsumed under affective empathy, and they are personal distress, which is possessing feelings of discomfort and anxiety in response to another's suffering. And then there's empathic concern, which is having compassion for others in response to their suffering. So mind blindness is a state where the ability to make automatic interpretations of events, taking into consideration the mental states of people, their desires, and beliefs, has not been developed or is lost in the person on the autism spectrum. So can you imagine living with a disorder in which you can't perceive or interpret the behavior of others? For example, their needs and desires, their feelings, beliefs, their goals, purposes. All of these things are a total mystery to you. The higher their anxiety goes, the worse the mind blindness, and the more difficulty they're going to have with interpersonal relationships and all the emotional nuances that come with relationships. So the social and cognitive impairments seen in people on the autism spectrum can be attributed to mind blindness. Let me repeat that. The social and cognitive impairments seen in people on the autism spectrum can be attributed to mind blindness. The abnormal behavior of these individuals includes a lack of reciprocity, difficulty empathizing with others, being totally withdrawn from social settings, especially under high stress, sometimes not being able to make eye contact, and again, if the anxiety is high, they have little to no desire to interact with other people, which we call social detachment. So one thing that often comes up when I'm working with neurotypical women in a relationship with a man on the autism spectrum, or vice versa, is she will say, I try to talk to him and he doesn't get it. I keep going over the same thing again and again and again. He doesn't get it. I keep trying to tell him what the problem is and what he can do to help alleviate the problem. He still doesn't get it. And so with this business of problem solving, what you're running into, if you're not getting the problem resolved, is you guys aren't agreeing on what the problem is. I run into this every time, as in 100%. She will go, when she's talking to him, well, the problem is this. And he'll go, no, that's not the problem. The real problem is that. And she will go, what? Are we on the same planet? No. This is the problem. I'm telling you, that's the problem. And he goes, no, that is not the problem. You're wrong. This is the problem. So you see where this gets nowhere, because the two of you can't even agree on what the freaking problem is to begin with. So the first step in problem solving, which doesn't even get to the desired result, because you have to first establish some kind of a bond or some kind of a trust that we are going to just worry about identifying the problem. Let's don't worry about solving it just yet. Let's just see if we can identify it. So that would be the first step. Now, I understand in some cases the two of you are just going to disagree what the problem is, and that's fine as long as you agree that you're going to disagree on what the problem is, but we still have found the problem. It's just now the problem is 1A and 1B. So it's still, in a sense, just one problem. It's just a two-pronged problem. So anyway, this is the deal that I run into is you guys are first going to have to somewhat agree on what the problem is, and then move from there. But if you say the problem is A, and he goes, no, the problem is B, and you try to compromise, negotiate, have a meeting of the minds based on two versions of the problem, most often that's going to be a fail, because he's going to want to resolve problem B while you're trying to resolve problem A, and since the two of you aren't working together, the rest is history. The problem doesn't get solved. I get questions from NT partners, and most often it's the wife, and they're often asked questions in the area of what are some of the traits that I need to know about in my husband or wife, as the case may be, with Asperger's or high-functioning autism, that get in the way of relationships. Is there any particular traits that I need to be really aware of? And there are. To help you understand your spouse or partner on the autism spectrum, just know that many of them turn their emotions way down, not off, but way down. And it comes from many years of emotions getting in the way of their logical way of thinking, okay? It's not that they don't have any room for emotions, it's just in their mind there isn't any need for emotions. Many people on the spectrum believe that emotions just get in the way of completing tasks because they are very task-oriented. They're more interested in things and tasks than they are in people. You could even think of their motto as being remove the emotions and accomplish the task more efficiently. So why does that cause a problem in the relationship? Because it should be painfully obvious that they're not going to tune into how they feel so much, and they're certainly not going to tune into how you feel. And if you try to tell them, well, I feel this way about that, and this hurt me, or whatever, and you expect him to take how you feel and apply it to a task he's supposed to complete, it's going to be a mismatch. The other thing that occurs oftentimes with people on the autism spectrum is they have challenges in understanding or predicting the consequences of their behavior on others. So they may say or do things that are hurtful. It's not their intention. Of course, I know there's the difference between intention and impact, but they will often say or do something. She will get upset, and he won't know why, but he will view her as being irrational, illogical, and overly emotional. Also keep in mind that since they have mind blindness issues and alexithymia issues, and if you need more information on that, just email me. My email is mbhutton@gmail.com. So since they have the mind blindness and alexithymia stuff going on, they view talking about the relationship problems as almost intolerable. They have a very difficult time hearing your negative emotions because they would view, I'm talking to the NTs here, they would view your different opinion or your attempt to explain a different perspective about a situation as criticism and you trying to start a fight. So when you have tried to explain things to him about a particular issue that you wanted to address, you may have found that you didn't get very far because you felt personally attacked. Another thing that causes problems in relationships that is a trait is to them, to the people on the spectrum, routines are paramount. They find great comfort in routine and structure, and they don't like change, and they will be very stressed out if you try to surprise them or change them in any way. And then the other big thing is they're, as I mentioned earlier, they're more task-oriented,
rather than relationship oriented. So their motto is kind of tasks first, relationships second. So if you have often had the thought that my husband with Asperger's, for example, he's more interested in his work or his special interests than me. Those things are more important to him than I am. So if you run into that, then you know what I'm talking about tasks first and relationships second. The other one and the last one that I'll talk about in this video, in an attempt to help you to understand your spouse with AS or high functioning autism, is you may have run into a situation where they always have to be right and or they always have to make you wrong. So and actually we're back to the mind blindness thing, so be sure to research that. If you go to adultaspergerschat.com, I have a bunch of information on that. So if I have this disorder called Asperger's or high functioning autism, this is a developmental disorder, which means that my social emotional brain is underdeveloped relative to my logical brain. And to complicate matters even worse, my logical brain is overly developed, which is a problem because now I can get stuck in analysis. I can get hooked on a thought, and it's hard for me to move from thought to action. So in other words, my social intelligence and my emotional intelligence is low, and my logic is too high. In fact, you could think of high functioning autism literally as a disorder of social skills, because it takes a lot of social and emotional intelligence to have well-defined social skills, obviously. So as a result of having this low-functioning social emotional brain, I have this thing called mind blindness. In other words, I have a hard time predicting what might be in the mind of my partner or spouse. I have a hard time imagining what they might be thinking or feeling. So I truly have no clue how the other person feels and thinks. So as a result, when they have a perspective or opinion that's different from mine, I can't wrap my brain around their perspective. I can't, in a sense, peel myself out of my body and crawl into her body and look through her eyes and see things through her lens. So if I have this mind blindness, her viewpoint makes utter nonsense to me. So since I'm blind to her perspective, I will tend to view her differing opinion as she's disagreeing with me. She's trying to argue with me, which is a thinking error. So I make this thinking error because she is disagreeing with me, therefore she's against me. I make that leap of logic right there. So then I continue with another thinking error. Because she's against me, I have to defend myself and prove that she's wrong and illogical and overly emotional. If I don't make her wrong, that means I'm wrong, because only one person can be right. And that must be me, since my perception is the only perception I can see. Emphasis on see, because I have mind blindness and I can't see hers. So in other words, since I can't comprehend her thoughts or feelings, her thoughts and feelings are not valid. Okay? So it's like, think of color blindness perhaps, where I'm colorblind, I have the Asperger's, and I'm colorblind, I only see in shades of gray. And the NT wife, for example, she sees this rich mosaic picture and she's pointing out all the colors. And she says, blue, red, well, look at that pretty turquoise. And I'm going, no, that's just all gray. And then we get into this argument because I have my filter and she has her filter. And since I can't see through her eyes and see all the different colors, I just assumed quite honestly that she's just a nutcase and doesn't even know what she's talking about. And I totally invalidate her opinion at that point.
So now we want to look at why an individual isolated problem that could occur later this afternoon may feel so much worse than it actually is. So when there is a relationship problem, we'll just say there's an argument over something that's important to one or perhaps both parties. And there is a heated exchange. Hurtful things are said and done. And it's, in some cases, just a brutal blowout. In retrospect, when you look back on that argument or that event, there's two memories. There's the content memory and the emotional memory. The content memory is what was said, and the emotional memory is how you felt during that argument. So when you're reflecting on that argument, maybe a week later or even a month later, you have content memory and emotional memory. So every time you remember that fight, we'll say, this verbal fight, you also feel the same negative emotions that you felt during that episode. And if you revisit the memory of that argument 2, 3, 4, 12 times, each time you're going to feel just as bad as you did in the moment. And so even though the event only happened once, it feels as though it's happened 12 times because you replayed that video in your head of the event, and each time you play it, each time you remember it, you feel it. And the other reason that a current isolated problem can feel so much worse than it actually is due to this cumulative effect of unresolved problems. If you're like most couples that I work with, you stop talking about problems because your conflict resolution skills as a couple sucked. Not only did you not get the problem solved, you just irritated and frustrated one another even worse than you were before you came into the discussion. So there's this pile of problems that just goes in the closet, and that pile is getting really tall. And so then a problem comes up that, let's say, is a level 3 on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very severe. So relative to some of the other problems, a level 3 problem is not a big deal. But when you throw it on top of an existing pile of problems, now you have the straw that can break the camel's back. So this is why it's imperative to come up with a communication strategy that you can use that doesn't end in a disaster, because you're going to remember the disaster. And each time you recall it, it's going to make it feel worse. And each time you have a problem that goes unresolved, if you guys don't talk about a problem, you don't forget about the problem. It just goes in the filing cabinet called unresolved problems. And when that list gets too long, both parties lose their confidence in their ability to problem solve, which even furthers the likelihood that they won't even attempt it. And now we're in trouble because you have a couple, both of which feel like they're always walking on thin ice. So in summary, the reason that a rather mild problem could feel like a super bad problem is due to the emotional memory factor and the cumulative effect of unresolved problems factor.
Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com. Today I want to talk to the neurotypical wives, and I have a question for you. Did you realize that your spouse with ASD may actually be afraid to discuss relationship difficulties with you? You probably knew that, right? Because whenever you tried to discuss relationship problems with him, he either gave you the illusion that he was listening, just to hurry up and get the conversation over with, or he did some version of a meltdown or a shutdown. So that should be evidence to you that he is literally afraid that the conversation, quote unquote, will deteriorate into yet another fight. Now, as you know, ASD level 1 or high functioning autism is a developmental disorder, which means that developmentally your spouse on the spectrum has a social emotional brain that is underdeveloped. In other words, he is low in social and emotional intelligence. This also means that his social and emotional needs are significantly lower than yours. So, when you want to discuss relationship issues with your ASD husband, you are, of course, going to be using your highly developed social and emotional intelligence as you try to make your points. Why wouldn't you? However, your ASD husband is listening with a highly logical brain that is also low in social and emotional competency. Therefore, he is not tracking your important message.
It's like you are very fluent in German, but he speaks just a little tiny bit of German. So as you're talking, he's only understanding and retaining about 10% of the total information, and he knows it. The typical partner on the autism spectrum knows that he is not fully understanding what his NT wife is thinking and feeling, and this honestly in some cases makes him feel stupid. The NT wife eventually realizes that her husband doesn't get it. She feels as though she has wasted her time and energy in trying to make him understand what she needs. So she understandably complains that he doesn't get it and may even accuse him of not caring and not listening. So this complaint now downloads in the autistic brain as criticism, disrespect, and ridicule. So this is why the man with ASD hates having difficult conversations with his wife. Now he feels stupid and chastised. He may think something along the lines of this: I don't understand what she is saying or feeling, which makes me feel dumb, and then I get in trouble for being dumb. So maybe you can see why difficult conversations about relationship problems would be something that he dreads. And when the NT wife says something along the lines of, well, we need to talk, you can be assured that his anxiety instantly increases as he forecasts yet another bad outcome. That would be a heated argument that yields no solution. So many men on the autism spectrum have literally reported that they are afraid of their NT wife, and they have used that term, afraid. They know that when there has to be a discussion on relationship problems, they're not going to fully grasp her perspective, and they're also going to be in trouble for not being able to grasp it. So most often, the ASD man will try to avoid these difficult conversations, and if that's not possible, he'll hurry up and agree to whatever you say purely to get the conversation over with as soon as possible, which instantly reduces his fear and the associated anxiety. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I got a brief message for the NT wives out there who are in a relationship with a husband on the autism spectrum, although what I'm about to say would apply if the inverse were the case as well. In other words, he is the NT and she is the one with autism spectrum disorder. But you may have run into a situation, and I'm sure you have, where you've tried to have a conversation with him about some of the relationship issues you'd like to resolve, and the thing just ended badly, and always does. And you just get to the point where you just give up even trying to have conversations about difficult topics. So what goes on, and this is kind of hidden, and honestly, this conversation is going to be a bit spooky because we're talking about stuff that's almost at a spiritual level. But anyway, you, by virtue of feeling emotionally deprived and not getting the emotional reciprocity that you want and honestly deserve, are in a state of anger, frustration, perhaps depression, anxiety, and so on. And why wouldn't you be? But when you go into a situation where now you're going to have a conversation with him, you come into that conversation negatively charged. And what I mean by that is you're giving off a negative vibration that he will pick up on. And he won't even know he's picking up on it. He'll just know that now his anxiety and anger is up, because now he has matched your vibration. And so we call this a vibrational match. In this case, it's a negative one. So now he is charged with an element of negativity. His anger, resentment, and so on now begins to rise, which now his negative energy field comes to you, which feeds your existing negativity, which then goes back to him, and so now you're in this negative feedback loop. So you're giving off a negative charge, he picks up on the negative charge, then becomes also a sender of more negative energy, which you pick up on, and we call this, again, a vibrational match. So I know this whole conversation is a little mysterious. It's something that you can't see, but you know there are things that exist, even though you can't see it, You're breathing right now. You don't actually see the air, for example. But you've already experienced this. Maybe you weren't conscious of it. Have you ever been around somebody and you just felt uneasy around that person? They weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't giving off any obvious facial cues or body language. They may not have even been talking. They were just within your field and you just felt uneasy around them and you didn't even know why. So we know that this business of having an energy field that extends a few feet beyond your actual physical body, we know that that exists. So this happens, but it happens more profoundly when the feelings in this case are more intense. And there's a wide range of emotions, and each emotion has different levels of intensity. Sadness is a low vibration. Panic is kind of a high vibration. They give off different levels of adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, cortisone, all of these fight or flight chemicals that get you either ready to run or to fight or to hide, or in this case we're talking about it gets you geared up to argue and fight and defend yourself and try to get the other person to cooperate and so on. All of that business is energy by definition. And you give off this energy, and that person that you're arguing with picks up on this energy, and that's why they argue right back. And that's why you get nowhere. All you've done is exchanged a bunch of negative energy. And now both parties are more resentful, more angry, and exhausted, and more willing to just give up because we never get anywhere with these conversations. So this begs the question, well, what can I do in that situation? Well, a good first step would be to be aware of what's going on behind the scenes. If you peel back the curtains, you will see that anger and anxiety is just waiting to leap out in energy form. And so when you try to have a conversation the next time with your husband, and by the way, this works both ways. The ASD husband needs to use this information when he has a gripe with his NT wife as well. Go into that conversation with a different mindset such that you are aware that you could get charged with negative energy. In other words, getting the chemicals going in you that stimulate anxiety and anger and frustration, and you're wanting things to be fair, you're wanting people to behave, you want to get people to do what you think they should be doing. All of that type of self-talk is getting your body charged up with negative energy. So the best thing you could do, and it would be a good first step, is to, when you go into this next conversation that may happen later today, ask yourself this question: how can I go into this conversation and have the mindset where I'm going to be positively charged? I'm going to come into this conversation with as much love, compassion, and gratitude as I can muster. I'm going to visualize how this person was back in the day when I actually enjoyed him and actually loved him and actually loved to be around him. I'm going to visualize that so that even though I may not necessarily feel that way today, that's going to be what I'm going to visualize, so that when I come into this conversation, I'm actually giving off positive vibes. And then he's going to pick up on some of that positivity. He's going to match you vibrationally. You get some of that positivity back. Now you're in a positive feedback loop. Links below this video for more information. Thanks, guys. You can't complain yourself out of a problem. This is a message to both the NT spouse as well as the spouse on the autism spectrum. A lot of times, couples believe that if they complain loudly enough and long enough, the other person will be motivated to change. I got some hot news for you. Your complaints are not the other person's motivation to change. In fact, quite the opposite. It will be his motivation to dig his heels in even deeper. So we're going to call this problem focus as opposed to problem solving. So you can do problem focusing or problem solving, but not at the same time. Let me specifically talk to the NT ladies now. If you just need to vent and get angry and have an emotional vomit in his lap for your own therapeutic purposes, just to get things off your chest, that's fine. go ahead and do it. But just know you're not going to be able to solve the problem with complaining. There is something to be said about venting. Sometimes you just have to get things off your chest, and that's fine. But again, you're just putting a Band-Aid on the symptom for the moment. You're not addressing the entire root cause. Sadly, what I run into too much is the couple is so resentful that they literally are not in a mental condition to work on the problem. They wouldn't be able to get into conflict resolution mode even if they willed themselves into it. And the harder they try in that state of mind, the worse it gets. In this case, it would be good for the NT wife to find her therapist, and then for the guy on the autism spectrum to find a different therapist, and for them to work on themselves individually and get their own issues ironed out. Then and only then will they be in a position to work on the relationship. You have to work on yourself first if you're so deep in the rabbit hole that conflict resolution is not even possible. So in many cases, there's a war going on in your home, the war of wills. It goes something like this. You need to change. You could change if you would just try harder. If you would just do better, we would be in a better position. And then the other party goes, I can't change. There's some things I can, some things I can't. You're complaining about the things I cannot change. And it goes back and forth, accusatory, trying to change the other person. And now you're stuck in the problem rather than the solution. So again, you can focus on the problem or you can focus on the solution, but you can't do both at the same time. And again, it's okay to vent, to get angry, to express your hurts. That's fine. There's a time and place for that. But if that's all you do, then you're basically living your life in pure hell. That gets old, and there's really no reason to live that way.
Hey, this is Mark Hutten. Would you like to schedule a one-on-one Zoom call? Okay, it's so simple. Just look under any of my videos in the description area. Click on this Calendly link. Now you see my calendar. Pick your month, your day, anytime that's available. Enter your name and email address. Then you'll get a follow-up email with the Zoom link on the day and time that you picked. And voila, we will talk.